my home, my country, but I need permission from the U.S. Army to get there. That question, it's pulled right from the sources you sent us, and it really just stops you in your tracks, doesn't it?
It really does. It's stark. And, the thing is, it's not some abstract question. It is the day-to-day reality for people in a specific village in South Korea.
Right, Geolsan-dong.
Yeah.
In Dongducheon City.
Exactly. And the way the sources describe it, an island on land, that paints a picture immediately.
An island on land, you look at the map, or even just imagine it, and you get it. Completely, or almost completely, surrounded by the fences of Camp Casey, a huge U.S. Army base.
Yeah, totally encircled.
So for what, decades, the people living there, they had a system, a way to make it work.
They did, yeah. For something like 70 years, their main way to get to, the city center was a road that actually cut through the base.
Through the base itself.
Right. They had special passes issued by the U.S. military, and that made it like a quick 10-minute drive.
Okay, 10 minutes. Because the other way,
yeah.
Well, it's not just longer, is it?
Oh, it's drastically different. That 10-minute trip was, well, essential. Without the pass, the only other option is this really long, difficult detour around the base.
And that whole setup, the passes, the access, that suddenly changed a couple of years back.
That's right. That's the heart of the problem now. In 2022, the U.S. military decided to stop issuing those passes. But crucially, only for new residents, people moving into Geolsan-dong.
So longtime residents might still have them, but anyone new is stuck.
That seems to be the situation, yeah. And it's thrown this community, which has, lived alongside the base for generations, into what feels like a real crisis.
Almost an existential threat, based on what we're reading.
That's definitely the feeling coming through. And, well, that's what we want to do today, right? Take a deep dive using these materials. Let's try to unpack it, all the unique geography, the bureaucratic tangle, the history behind it, and maybe most importantly, the real human cost. Why this village feels like a promise was broken, why people feel trapped.
Okay, let's start there. Paint that picture of isolation. What does island on land actually mean for daily life?
Well, just imagine it. Your home, your village, but step outside and you're literally facing military fences, barbed wire, the edge of Camp Casey, basically surrounding you.
And that road through the base wasn't just a nice shortcut. It was pretty much their lifeline.
It really sounds like it. The sources make that contrast so clear. 10 minutes with a pass driving through the base.
Versus the alternative.
Yeah.
Which sounds awful, frankly.
Yeah, punishing is a good word. The sources describe it as about a 10-kilometer detour. It winds up over a mountain, apparently taking at least an hour.
An hour instead of 10 minutes.
Right, and parts of it are unpaved, supposedly really rough driving.
So it's not just slow. It sounds genuinely risky.
That's a key point they make. It's treacherous, especially, in bad weather, winter snow, heavy rain.
Yeah.
The risk of falling rocks is mentioned. It sounds like it can become basically impassable sometimes.
Okay, so you've got this isolated village dependent on this base road. Then 2022 happens. Access gets cut off for newcomers. What's the immediate fallout? What are people actually experiencing?
The effects were immediate and really, really tough.
I keep thinking about the older residents. The sources mention quite a few elderly people live there.
Yeah, that's right. It's a small place, maybe 90 residents total, and many are over 65. There's a quote from an 86-year-old man, No Suil. He talks about that mountain road, the one you have to take without a pass.
What does he say?
He says, it's hard enough for a young person. Imagine what it's like for us old folks. And then he adds, if it snows in winter, we're simply trapped.
Simply trapped. Wow, that really hits home. And that fear, it must go beyond just getting groceries, right? Emergencies.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge worry. Hwa Mok-san, she's the head of the Village Women's Association. She talks about that feel, if someone needs an ambulance.
Because the ambulance has to take the long way.
Exactly. That winding mountain road. She says it takes 25, maybe 30 minutes. And they live with this constant fear of missing the golden time, that critical window for medical help.
So it's daily hardship. It's this fear for their health and safety. And the sources also suggest this is actually threatening the village's future, its very existence.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, think about it. If new people moving in can't get the passes they need for reasonable access, who's going to move there?
Right. Nobody.
And the sources state pretty clearly that the housing market, the land market in Geolsan-dong, it's just collapsed.
It's like the village is being strangled.
That's the kind of language people are using. Sarah J. Su, the village chief, he's quoted saying something like, it feels like they are trying to wipe our village off the map. Just devastating.
Yeah.
And there's another resident just identified as No, 60 years old. He moved there recently, so he's stuck with the mountain road.
Hmm.
He talks about feeling his property rights are just being trampled on. The overall feeling seems to be that the village is facing a slow extinction.
That phrasing wiped off the map. Slow extinction. It sounds like they feel their basic rights are being ignored.
Totally. They see it as violating fundamental rights, like freedom of movement, freedom to live where you choose in your own country. And then adding insult to injury, there's hardly any public transport. A village bus runs just twice a day. It really compounds the isolation.
Okay, so the isolation, the impact, it's incredibly clear and severe, which leads to the big question, why? Why can't the South Korean government just tell the U.S. military, issue the passes? It's Korean land, Korean citizens.
And that's where it gets really complex. It comes down to jurisdiction. And the U.S. military's stated reason, base security.
Okay, base security. Every military needs that.
Yeah.
But how does that justify cutting off access for residents living outside the fence?
Well, it ties into the Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA, that agreement between South Korea and the U.S.
Right, SOFA. That governs the legal status of U.S. troops and personnel in Korea.
Exactly. And one key part of SOFA gives the U.S. military administrative authority inside its bases.
Inside the fence line.
Right, administrative authority. And that means...
They control who comes in and out, security procedures, everything on their side of the fence.
Precisely. And here's the kicker, according to the sources. Under SOFA, that authority effectively limits how much South Korean authorities, the city, the province, even the Ministry of Defense, can force the U.S. military to change its access policies on base, even if it affects South Korean citizens needing to cross that land to get home.
So an international treaty aimed at the big picture of security creates this loophole almost.
Yeah.
Where Korean citizens' basic access depends on U.S. military rules on Korean soil.
That seems to be the nub of the impasse. South Korean officials feel their hands are tied legally by SOFA. They can ask, they can negotiate, but they feel they can't compel the U.S. to issue those passes.
And this whole mess in Geolsan-dong, it feels like it's deeply tangled up with the much longer story of Dongducheon City and the U.S. military presence there?
Oh, absolutely. It's inseparable. Dongducheon has hosted U.S. forces for, 70 years now? It's part of the fabric of the city, tied to the whole U.S.-South Korea alliance.
And the sources really emphasize the scale of Dongducheon's contribution, or sacrifice, over that time.
The numbers are pretty stark. Dongducheon, the city, has given up 42% of its total land area to the U.S. military.
42%. Just pause on that. Nearly half the city's land.
It's enormous. And they've tried to quantify the economic impact, too. Estimates range, but we're talking maybe over $20 billion, or 25 trillion won cumulatively over 70 years. Hundreds of billions of won annually in lost economic potential.
So it's not just land, it's lost opportunity, lost tax base, lost development potential, a constant economic drag for 7 decades.
That's the point local leaders and residents are making. They see this as a huge sacrifice made for the sake of the alliance for national security. And this history of sacrifice makes the current situation feel even more like a betrayal, especially when they talk about broken promises.
Okay, broken promises. How does that fit in?
Well, the sources draw this really sharp contrast with another city, Pyeongtaek. That's where the U.S. consolidated a lot of its forces recently.
Right. Camp Humphreys is there. Huge base.
Huge base. And when that happened, the South Korean government poured billions of dollars into Pyeongtaek. Infrastructure, support programs, development aid.
And Dongducheon is looking at that and saying...
They're saying, wait a minute. Pyeongtaek got all this support for hosting bases on about 3% of its land. We've given up 42% for decades, and promises made to us years ago promising similar levels of support and development aid. Those promises haven't been kept.
Wow, okay. You can see why they'd feel aggrieved. That comparison is pretty damning.
It fuels a lot of the frustration. There's a quote from Shim Woo-hyeon. He chairs a local civic group. He calls it blatant discrimination. He says it's a dereliction of duty by the state towards Dongducheon. Strong words.
Very strong. So given all this, the history, the hardship in Geolsan-dong now, the feeling of being ignored, what are people actually doing about it?
Well, they're not just sitting back, they're mobilizing. The Dongducheon City Council citizens groups, they've started protests.
Right. The sources mentioned they began around June 9th.
Yeah, quite recently. They're doing these one-person relay protests, standing outside government buildings, trying to raise awareness and pressure the government and indirectly the U.S. military.
And what exactly are they asking for? What are the specific demands?
They're pretty concrete. The city council and the citizen groups, they want 4 main things, basically. First, a special law. Something specifically designed to support areas like Dongducheon that have had large chunks of land used for bases for a long time and haven't gotten it back or been compensated fairly.
Okay, a dedicated support law.
Second, they want support and compensation equivalent to what Pyeongtaek got. Level the playing field, essentially.
Makes sense, given the comparison.
Third, they want the government to actively push for a big national industrial project in Dongducheon. Something to genuinely boost the local economy after decades of sacrifice.
Right. Real economic development.
And fourth, the immediate one, the one that directly affects Geolsan-dong. Renew the passes for new residents immediately. Solve that access crisis.
It really comes down to feeling like their basic rights as citizens are being sidelined.
That comes through loud and clear from local officials quoted in the sources. Hwang Go-ryong, the city council vice chairman, he puts it plainly. Citizens' rights shouldn't depend on U.S. military decisions. He says the government needs to step up and keep its promises.
And the council chairman, too.
Yeah, Kim Song-ho. He's quoted urging both the Korean government and the U.S. not to ignore these people's pleas. He stresses it's the government's job to protect fundamental rights like freedom of movement and property rights.
Listening to that, you really get the sense of desperation, but also determination.
Absolutely. It brings it right back to the human level, the people actually living this every day.
So let's pull back a bit. We focused on Geolsan-dong, this one village. What does this specific, quite unique situation tell us about the bigger picture?
I think, first, it hammers home that this pass issue isn't just some minor inconvenience. For this community, it really is about survival. It's an existential threat to the village as they know it.
And beyond the village itself, it forces us to ask some pretty fundamental questions, doesn't it?
It really does. Questions about sovereignty, Who really has the final say on Korean land? It starkly highlights the human cost, the local cost of these big international military alliances. Are we balancing national security needs with the well-being of the communities most affected?
And it raises that question of fairness, of reciprocity. Will governments actually honor the sacrifices made by people who've lived with these burdens for generations?
Yeah, the feeling from residents seems to be, we've paid our dues for national security for 70 years. Why are we being ignored now? Why is our situation treated as less important?
It's a powerful undercurrent in all the sources.
Definitely. This sense of having done their part and now being left high and dry.
Okay, so to try and wrap this up, we have the small village, Geolsan-dong, caught in this incredibly complex bind. Their daily lives, their safety, maybe their whole future, are tangled up in U.S.-based security needs. A long history of sacrifice, promises from their own government that feel broken, and these tricky legal issues around SOFA.
It's like a microcosm, isn't it? A really intense, localized example of how huge international agreements and military deployments can have these incredibly direct, sometimes devastating impacts on ordinary people's lives.
And that's really the connection for you listening to this. Geolsan-dong's story is specific, but it echoes globally. It raises those bigger questions. When national security demands local sacrifice, what happens next? What responsibility do governments have to the citizens whose lives are fundamentally altered, sometimes restricted, by these geopolitical arrangements?
Exactly. And these protests they're holding, they're described as dignified. It's not just complaining, it's a plea. A plea for their sacrifice to mean something, for promises to be kept, and at its core, for their rights as citizens in their own country to simply be respected.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? How do you strike that balance? How should governments weigh national security, international partnerships against the fundamental rights, the property, the sheer daily well-being of the citizens living right there, in the shadow of it all?